This video is going to look at form and structure in Porphyria's Lover. And again, like I said on the previous video, there's an awful lot to say about this poem, and this is just looking at some elements. It doesn't purport to be a comprehensive review of the poem. But what I'd like you to focus on are specifically poetic techniques along with the language analysis. Because if you're writing about the poem or a poem, there's all sorts of things that you can talk about in the usual run of language analysis. You've got all of those methods and decisions that writers are making. But in addition to that, you've got all the elements of constructing a poem, of writing a poem. So things that you more specifically focus in on in poems, like caesura, enjambment, end stopping, where the line breaks are, the rhyme, the rhythm, the meter. All of those things can work together to actually add to your understanding of the content of the poem. So when we're looking at analytical writing and it says think about language, form and structure, here we're going to focus in a little bit more on the form and structure elements, the language kind of being the subject of a different video. So first of all, if we start over here, and I'm just going to annotate in red to distinguish from the notes I've already made, an overview of the poem. It's a dramatic monologue, so mono meaning one, log to do with language and speaking. So we have one person speaking. And very quickly we realise we need to distinguish the speaker and the poet, because this is not Robert Browning speaking. This is the speaker. This is Porphyria's lover. And structurally, he makes himself as important or more important than Porphyria just by how the poem's entitled. This is not called Porphyria or the death of Porphyria. It's about Porphyria's lover. The speaker is making it about himself by the way he's titled the poem. This is one of Browning's Madhouse Cells poems, and therefore he's constructed this darker persona to explore psychological disruption, to explore that abnormal psyche, that madness. So we have got this speaker in the first person who we know is disturbed. To add to that, there are also the kind of Gothic elements of the poem. We talked about pathetic fallacy and the setting in the previous video. But looking at how those first 5 lines are presented, if you just take these 5 lines up to where I've put the red line there and read them out loud. As the rain set early in tonight, the sullen wind was soon awake. It tore the elm tops down for spite and did its worst to vex the lake. I listened with heart fit to break. You might start to detect that there is a change to the poem's rhythm, the poem's meter on this line 5. And that's because the poem is largely written in iambic tetrameter. Okay, and you can see there, just a little note, that one iamb, and that's an iamb rather than a lamb, one iamb is a 2-syllable unit that goes didum in terms of its stress pattern, and tetrameter means that there are 4 iambs in the line. So you have a line of 8 syllables following that didum, didum, didum pattern. There are interruptions to the meter at different points, and it repays kind of reading the poem out loud and seeing if you can spot where that regular pattern is interrupted. Because, for example, line 5, there is that beat missing here, and it's when the narrator is being introduced. So here Browning uses the interruption to the otherwise regular iambic tetrameter to reflect the interruption that the narrator's presence causes, or to suggest that the narrator himself is some sort of aberration. Okay, and that's the kind of language that you're seeking to explain it in. We can talk then about line breaks and enjambment and the focus. Now, line breaks and enjambment are really interesting because poets have chosen a meter, they've chosen their words, they've chosen often a syllable count, and therefore the decision about which word they leave hanging on the end of a line is significant. So here we have our line break here, make sure that the focus is straight in on Porphyria, as well as her actions being seamless. Okay? So you can look at this section, and I would go through any poem you're looking at, and I'd look at where you've got end stops and what's happening, and where you haven't got end stops. And these are more end stopped than not. So to what extent do we have this kind of sequence, this orderly thing, the end stops reflecting a reasonable tone, which is completely in contrast with the narrator's actions, with the speaker's actions? Where have we got that enjambment where it kind of automatically flicks through? Here it's almost like he's kind of captivated by this kind of slow and sensual kind of removal of these garments as he's watching her. You can look then at caesura. Where are we being made to pause? What is significant about those pauses? So here, if you look, we've got that dash, okay? And at the moment, at that point, you know, Porphyria is murmuring how she loved me, and yet he pauses here to reflect on all of the faults he perceives in her. And the faults he perceives in her are the fact that she does not totally give herself to him at that moment, or earlier than that, that she still, you know, will not set her heart free from things that he considers to be vainer passions. He wants this absolute possession of her. Now again, you've probably noticed that there is a rhyme scheme going on in this poem. And if you haven't come across this technique before, when you kind of A-B out a rhyme scheme, it's a quick way of identifying where the rhymes fall at the end of a line. So what you do is you take a sound, the first line as being your A sound. So your A rhyme is ite. Okay, so you've got that sound. So anytime you end up with that, so night, spite, you put the A in for that end of that line. And then here you've got, that's your B rhyme, ache. So awake, lake, break is then your B rhyme, and so you follow that on. So as your rhyme scheme becomes increasingly complicated in a bigger poem, maybe you get this big pattern of all sorts of letters. So in something like a sonnet, you can track the rhyme scheme all the way through to a kind of G rhyme, where you've got the different sounds that keep coming back at different points in that rhyme scheme. So here we're looking at the fact that this follows a kind of quintain pattern, that the rhyme scheme divides it into groups of 5 lines, quin 5, but it doesn't make any sense to make it into stanzas. It is all one stanza, which in itself might reflect the fact that once this action has started, it's kind of inevitable that he's going to do what he's doing. There's no stopping him. And indeed, at the end of the poem, the narrator himself comments that God has not yet said a word, in terms of, nothing has stopped him once it's started. But to go back to the rhyme scheme, we look at it and you've got this kind of double B rhyme at the end. So it's not A, B, A, B, A. It gives that asymmetrical, it's not symmetrical, it's not balanced as a set of 5 lines. But there is that discipline behind the fact that it is a rhyme scheme. So even the content, or even the structure of the poem rather, reflects the content and the tone. We have a narrator who is inherently unbalanced, who is inherently unstable, and yet there seems to be a strange controlled discipline in what he's doing. So then looking around, just some points to pick up on in this second section, and there's no reasoning for the way I've divided the poem up other than to fit it onto these slides. If you look at the caesura here, for example, we've got the rhyme scheme carries on in that, or the rhythm rather, carries on in that iambic tetrameter pattern, but the caesura, so the punctuation in the middle of that line, kind of throws it slightly out of rhythm. And it's that moment of realisation. You couple that with the idea that this line is longer And you have that extra beat in there maybe to reflect his realisation. Okay? You look at the idea of the kind of debate in the middle of that line. You know, his emotion is growing while he debates. He very clearly claims that he rationalises with himself what to do. And then you get that slightly more erratic, slightly more irregular interruption by those three monosyllabic words, each with the stress on them. That moment she was mine, fair. Okay, so again, an interruption in the meter to emphasise the intensity of his feeling or realisation, maybe. We talked about the assonance in the wound and around, and you kind of got here the little structural point here, in terms of his perception of her feeling. He both here linguistically kind of puts himself at the centre of this plan and also removes himself, because we begin and end with this idea of no pain, that assertion. He wraps around his belief that there was no suffering involved in her death, begins and ends with that. He is in the centre of it in terms of, I am quite sure she felt no pain. And yet he doesn't acknowledge his role in what's happened. It's almost like he's considering an event that he's had nothing to do with and the effect that it may or may not have had on her. Nice little point here in terms of the plosive alliteration, in terms of his enthusiasm, his excitement coming out there, the blushed bright beneath my burning kiss. And again, another interruption to the stress pattern here. As things change, okay, only this time, my shoulder bore her head. So again, we've had another inversion. What she'd done before, he's now doing back to her. It's just that he's dead. She's dead. And the big kind of structural thing at the end is obviously the change of tense in terms of the immediacy that goes here, and thus we sit together now. So actually the change of tense is there. And it ends on this kind of almost frightening note that he's challenging the kind of judgment of the universe to comment on his actions, and is maybe taking it that because there's been no judgment, because there's been no divine retribution, that, you know, is he questioning the existence of a God? Is he saying that, you know, God hasn't noticed? Is he beyond kind of being corrected or being brought up by God? And you can look that, you know, this last kind of almost surprised, and it ends on this rhyming couplet, you know, stirred and word, that kind of surprise that he's got, that, you know, nothing's happened. I've done this and nothing's happened. And as readers, you know, we are brought into the immediacy of the moment and the injustice of the fact that he does appear to have got away with it. He is sitting there with the confidence shown by that final rhyming couplet, almost as a challenge. So where do you go with this? Well, I'd look at annotating up your copy of the poem, so you've got some of those ideas down, and you've got your own ideas down. If you notice other things, as I say, this isn't a comprehensive way of looking at the poem. And then think about, how does Browning use form and structure in the poem Porphyria's Lover? And I think carefully about your topic sentences. So Browning uses give the method to create a sense of, or to emphasise, or to show. And if you can come up with 3, 4, 5, 6 points that Browning uses this particular thing about form and structure to show this or these points, then you're starting to structure a good analytical essay looking at those specifically poetic techniques. The other way of looking around is to, you know, kind of maybe draw on other analysis you can find. Look at some reliable websites. LitCharts is a good website. Anything to do with e-notes if you've got access. And there's also a good website called Madame Anglaise, and she also does a good analysis of Porphyria's lover talking about scansion and the like. So do see what you can find and kind of come across multiple interpretations of it. Okay, good luck.